Today, we're peeling back the layers on an urgent issue that's shaking the very foundation of the real estate world as we know it. If you've ever felt the pressure of skyrocketing home prices or wondered how to break into the market that seems increasingly out of reach, you can't afford to miss this conversation. With the rising cost of property, especially here in the Toronto and Greater Toronto area, many are finding it challenging to break into the housing market on their own. As a result, a growing number of people are exploring the option of purchasing a home with a friend or family member. This type of home ownership is known as joint ownership. But is this a savvy financial move or a risky venture? To help us navigate the complexities of joint home ownership, we've invited a special guest to the show. Corina Murphy is a mortgage broker with Premier Mortgage Center here in the GTA, and she is going to share her expert insights on the subject. We'll be discussing the advantages of buying a home with someone else, but we'll also speak to the challenges and potential pitfalls that you should be aware of. So whether you're a first-time homebuyer considering this option, or perhaps you're a parent who's thinking of helping their children get into the market, maybe you are looking to buy with a friend, or simply curious about the evolving landscape of the real estate market. Any way you look at it, you won't want to miss this candid conversation. Today, I wanted to talk about a very prevalent issue that faces so many would-be homebuyers here within the Greater Toronto area, and that is the pressure of skyrocketing home prices and their effect on affordability and qualifications, which ultimately affects a person's ability to enter into the real estate market. As a result of these pressures, we are seeing an increasing number of people banding together, pulling their resources in order to buy a home via a joint home ownership scenario. These joint home ownerships can involve friends, family members, or even business partners. So thank you so much, Corina, for joining us today to talk about this subject. Welcome back.
Thank you, Evelyn. Always lovely to be here.
Right. So we've been talking quite a bit lately just about the cost of buying a home and how difficult it is for so many first-time home buyers to get into the marketplace. And you shared some tips in a previous podcast where you were saying there's all kinds of different ways you can structure your mortgages. And today we were going to dive into one of the ways that two different people can pool their finances together and buy a home together so that it becomes a little bit less stressful and a little bit more manageable. And that's through joint home ownership. So maybe we can start with an explanation of what joint home ownership actually is.
For sure. So as you know, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get into the housing market, especially as a young person, because we've got the stress test, the house prices have gone up, and the interest rates are quite high. So when we're looking at individuals getting into the housing market with the stress test, we're typically right now looking at around an interest rate of, let's call it 8.5%. So that's quite aggressive. So you may have somebody that's making a good income, but they can't quite meet that stress test. So people are looking for some creative ways to try and get their foot into the market. And it doesn't have to be a long-term thing. It could be short-term. So we're seeing people, friends getting together, siblings, purchasing properties together to help them get into the market. And again, it might be a short-term thing with a goal of, say, in 3 to 5 years down the road, maybe they're going to sell that property and split the equity. So I think it's a great discussion to have because people are, again, looking for creative ideas to get into the housing market.
Okay. And so if they were to band together and pool their resources, there's basically two types of ownership here in the province of Ontario. One is joint tenancy and the other one is tenancy in common. So how can they structure that type of ownership when purchasing a property and basically registering the mortgage on the property?
Right. So joint tenancy, basically when I look at that, the easiest way to explain it is if you have a couple, let's say a married couple, and they're purchasing a property together and they're both coming in with equal down payment, you would do joint tenancy. So basically, each owner has the right of survivorship, which means if one of the joint tenants dies, then the share of the property automatically goes to the other person. And then there's also tenancy in common. So this would be used more so if two, let's say, friends are purchasing a property together, or two individuals where they're having separate percentages of down payment. And you can register the percentage of the down payment. So let's say, for example, one person's coming with 25% of the down payment and the other has 75. You can register it that way. We also see it a lot when a parent is helping a child purchase a home and they have to go on title to help the child qualify. We can set it up with the child as 99% ownership and the parent as 1%. And that also will help with the capital gains. So we see that quite often as well.
Okay. So what are the advantages of, say, joint tenancy is pretty straightforward. It's 50-50 in, 50-50 out. Tenancy in common probably, as you mentioned, would be more specific to when friends come in or parents are helping their kids or even other relatives are giving money to help with a purchase. So whoever puts in X amount is going to register themselves as X amount ownership on that property. So the benefits, as you said, one of them would be in terms of capital gains, but there are other benefits to actually registering your different percentages of ownership. Can you maybe speak to what some of those other benefits are?
Yeah, for sure. So, when you're purchasing a property with somebody that you're not going to be living with for a long period of time, it's important to really define the roles of that property and how you're going to share it, especially if you're coming into it with different down payments. You don't want to have any disputes down the road if you decide to sell the property. It should be clear cut what each person's coming into the property with and what they should walk away with. Also, cost sharing. So it helps with the financial burden of ownership and sharing the costs of owning a home, including the mortgage, the property taxes, utilities, any repairs that might have to be done.
So in terms of joint tenancy, we know, that basically it's what you put in is what you get out. So if you put 50% in, you get 50% out. It's usually with a married couple, as you said. And then we have tenancy in common, which really deals with a lot of the other situations that we have. So it could be two friends that come in, one maybe puts 60%, the other puts 40%. But it also is important when, say, a family or friend or a family or parent is giving money towards that purchase. So maybe the parent is giving, 60% down payment to help. And they may just say, well, this is your early inheritance. But by registering themselves, the parent, as tenancy in common, they're also helping to protect not only the money that they put into that purchase, but also their child should something not go well with, say, somebody who ends up moving in with them with a relationship, right? So maybe you can speak to how that can also be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the reality is relationships don't always last, right? And you have to be cognizant of that. And also, we're seeing a lot of down payments come from parents and co-signing, and they've worked hard for that money. They're gifting the money to their child. If the child's buying with a partner or a spouse, they want to make sure that that money is protected. So by registering it that way, that's also another way to add a layer of protection in case that relationship were to dissolve. Again, it's clear cut who's getting what and what percentage is going to each person that's going on title.
Right.
So,
And
yeah,
I
I think
know,
that's a really good point.
right. And I know it's something that we don't think about when we're with someone, we think it's forever. But I know in
Yeah.
the years that I've been, helping parents help their kids get in the market, we've talked about that. And they, I've
Mhm.
basically said you should speak to your lawyer. You should, look at ways to protect that money in case something does happen. And, unfortunately, it has quite a few times, but they've been
Mhm.
protected. Their kids have been protected because they've looked at it beforehand. You have to sort of address this before you get into that situation. Overall, there is risks in having a tenancy in common ownership, but there's also a lot of benefits. Maybe you can talk about some of the positive things that come out of buying a home together with somebody else.
For sure. So lots of positives. I think the big one is cost sharing. So having another person carry the burden of the financial aspects that come along with owning a home. You've got your mortgage, property taxes, utilities, insurance. If it's a condo, you've got those maintenance fees. And, given the cost of living right now and the cost of property and interest rates, it's really hard for someone to carry the cost of that compared to, let's say, a year ago when interest rates were much lower. And we all know real estate is the fastest way to wealth. So if you can find someone to purchase a property with and get your foot in the door and share those costs down the road, for sure, it's going to be very beneficial to both parties. Also, when you're purchasing with somebody else, we're using two incomes. So we have a little bit more income to help maybe purchase that property that you really want versus, purchasing on your own. If we're looking at young Canadians, say for example, someone making $100,000 a year they're not qualifying for anything, which is really scary, right? We've got nurses, policemen, firefighters out there, and they can't qualify for anything on their own. The other is shared responsibility. So it's not just on you to make sure that you're looking after the maintenance of the home, the household chores. And also, the last one that I can think of is companionship. So having somebody else there to rely on emotionally, financially, to share that property, I think are all great benefits.
Right. So if somebody was buying, they were one person was putting, like we said in this example, 60% in, and the other person was 40% in. Does that mean that the person that's putting 60% in would also be responsible for 60% of the taxes, 60% of the maintenance costs, or can it vary depending on what they've agreed to after the fact?
Yeah, I think it can totally vary. I mean, you can look at it from that angle. Let's say one person's making more money than the other, or your down payment is different, maybe 60-40, but you're splitting all the other costs 50-50. So I know you and I have done another podcast titled, like, talking about cohabitation agreements. So
Mhm.
I would still, even if you're doing, whichever way you're going to register the property, I still think you should have a cohabitation agreement, which does outline those points. I think that's very important to have. That way, there's no miscommunication, no mistakes down the road. It's all black and white. And, if you decide to sell that property down the road, everybody is on the same page. It's a simple math equation to figure out what each party is supposed to get. But you can be really creative with that and figure it out the best way that you can. At the end of the day, if it's all in writing and everybody knows what their responsibilities are, it's going to be easier to divide the assets, or the equity, I should say, after the fact.
Right. And that was a really valid point that you did make on that previous podcast, was the exit strategy, as you called it. What happens when it's
Hmm.
time to leave. So I'll put that link to that podcast in the show notes as well. And if people want to get a
Hmm.
little bit more information on that discussion, that will be there for
Right.
them as well. So in terms of pitfalls, what are the pitfalls or some of the pitfalls associated with purchasing a home with somebody else?
So we can just kind of switch back to the exit strategy, right? At some point, if you're buying with a friend, say for example, you're going to want to maybe exit that property at some point. Whether, you're making more money and you want to buy another home on your own, or you're starting a family, or you're getting married, whatever your situation may be, maybe you're moving provinces for a job, or what have you. It's, you have to figure out how that exit plan is going to work. And that's just going to take some time to sit down and talk it through. So option A, if somebody needs to exit the property, let's say within 2 to 3 months because they're moving for a job, what's that going to look like? So the options would be the current or the other party could apply to qualify to carry the mortgage on their own. If that's not a possibility, then option B is you're looking at either having another person come on to replace that person. So you're doing another mortgage application, you're getting an approval for that. Or C would be, okay, maybe you have to sell the property. There actually could be a D as well. Maybe you're both exiting the property and you're going to rent it out and then go your separate ways and then still continue on with the equity. So there's a couple of options there.
So, sorry, a quick question. I don't want to
Yep.
break your train of thought. When you said that, say somebody buys it together and then a year down the road, one of them is moving for a job. And then you said somebody else can come on to the mortgage. So when the bank looks at it, obviously it's a whole new requalification. Does that original person who was on the mortgage and is now removed, is their liability totally erased or are they still liable?
No, their liability would be removed. So they would be removed from the mortgage and they would also be removed from title. So you would have to use a lawyer in this scenario, again, because you want to make sure that that person has been removed from title.
Okay. And so are they applying for a brand new mortgage then?
So the process would be the same as if they're applying for a brand new mortgage, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're breaking the terms of the current mortgage that they have. The rate could stay the same, the term. They're just basically substituting the other borrower for somebody else. So the other one that we can talk about is financial risk. So what if you're living with your friend and one of them loses their jobs? And now they're not able to carry their portion of the expenses. What do you do? So it's always a good idea to have a little bit of a safety net in your account for situations like this. A financial planner would tell you that you should have around 6 months of expenses as a savings account. We know the reality of that, especially when you're young. That's really hard. So that might be meaning, you may have to talk to your parents like, hey, I'm moving out. Here's our plan. We've carefully thought it out. But in the situation that one of us loses our job or something happens, am I able to maybe rely on you for some help for a short period of time? Or you may have to sell the property. So you have to think further down the road, things that can happen should situations like this arise. So creating the plan to address the issues is key, because if this happens, you're scrambling at the last minute, nobody's prepared. So being prepared in advance always works. And if you are thinking about buying with a friend, you may want to put some of that savings that you have aside for situations like this when they occur. So you're not draining all your expenses on your down payment.
Right. And I think that's a good tip, whether you're buying with somebody else or buying by yourself, is to not go to your nth limit, that you're first of all stressed out, but that you don't have anything to fall back on should you need, because there's always expenses that come up with owning a home. So having a little bit of a cushion put to the side is always, I think, a good financial position to be in. Now, we also know that living with somebody has its own challenges, as in how you live,
Yeah.
right? Some people are super neat freaks and other ones not so much. So maybe
Yeah.
we can talk about some of the differences in lifestyles and really the expectations that each person has, like
Yeah.
you said before, in terms of even things like chores. Who's going to do the chores? Who's going to, do the groceries? Who's going to just take care of cutting the grass and cleaning the inside?
Yeah.
And those are all definitely things I think that they have to think about, right?
Oh, for sure. Now, I've had 2 kids in university and they shared houses with people. And so my daughter lived in a house with 5 other girls. And I mean, the most of them were pretty good. There was the one that, didn't quite do her share. And that caused a lot of frustration with the other girls. My son, he lived in a house with all boys, so it was always a disaster. I mean, for him to text me sometimes and say, this house really needs to be cleaned, it must have been really dirty. So
Mhm.
having those agreements in place again, I mean, it's almost like if you're buying with a friend, you should go see a marriage counselor first and talk all this through because I love my husband, but sometimes, yeah, I'm like, okay, but that's just living with somebody, right? And the more time you spend with someone, sometimes you take them for granted, right? And maybe you're not pulling your share of the weight. So again, communication has to be key. You have to make sure that you know what each person's responsibilities are. I mean, you can make a chore chart like we did with our kids when they were younger, but yeah, it definitely can cause some issues. And if it starts to go sour, it can go sour fast.
Being
That's okay.
prepared, yeah. So no, I was just going to say that it's really true because having a friend that you go out and party with is one thing. Having a friend that you live
Hmm.
with is something totally different. So your comment about
Yeah.
communication is key, and it is like going to a marriage counselor or one of
Hmm.
sometimes you go to one before you get married to like, have you thought about this? Have you talked about this? Right. So just sort of
Yeah.
saying like, what do you like to do? What don't you like to do? What's your expectations so that there are no surprises and more importantly, no regrets, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
Right.
The other thing I can think of that could come up as a pitfall is maybe credit issues.
Mhm.
Okay, so if you're entering into home ownership with somebody, that's going on your credit report. So if there's any issues with the other person not paying, which is going to cause you to not be able to fulfill the monthly obligations as well, that's going to show up on your credit report, which is going to affect you in the future. So again, that's super important. Insurance liability. So if there's any damages or repairs that need to be done, how's that going to be covered? If somebody broke something, do you split the cost or is that your cost that you have to absorb? Tax implications as well. When you sell the property, if there's capital gains, you also have to think about that. Always, always, always consult an accountant when you're going into something like that. So I'm not an accountant. I don't claim to be an accountant. I can give you inside information, but I also will strongly recommend that people consult with their accountant before they venture down this path as well.
Absolutely. Their accountant and also their lawyer who will, think of things that
Hmm.
we may not have considered. So we've talked about some of the risks, financial communication, talked about our future plans, credit and mortgage issues, and exit strategies, liabilities, and tax implications. So I think that is definitely a great list for people to start with when they're considering going into a purchase with somebody else. So,
Hmm.
any other parting tips or considerations do you think, especially in terms of a parent assisting their children, in terms of the
Yeah.
mortgage ability of it or the mortgage side of it?
Yeah, so I mean, I would have to say in the last couple of years, I've had more discussions with parents and parents going on title and gifting large amounts of money than we've ever seen in the past. And that just is because of interest rates, the stress test, and the cost of properties these days, right? We have a housing shortage. So I think it's wonderful when a parent can gift money to their child now versus waiting until they pass. We call it like a living inheritance.
Mhm.
It's very nice to see the joy of the parents being able to do that for their children and the children also receiving the benefit of that. Not everybody can do it, but for those lucky ones out there, it's great. If there's any expectation that those funds have to be repaid to the parents, that's also discussion that should be had at the get-go. But if people can do it, 100%. Now, I've had situations where we've had parents that are wanting to gift or co-sign, but we'll look at the application, go through, I'll point out what the carrying costs are going to be. And even though a parent may be co-signing, if that child can't fully cover those financial obligations monthly, it's not a good decision for them to purchase the home unless the parents are going to be matching some of the or paying some of the costs of carrying that mortgage. So there's one thing in having a parent co-sign, but the child still has to be able to carry the payments and still be able to live and do things, right?
I think that's a really good point because I have a lot of times discussions with young people or even older people who say, I'm going to get my parents or somebody to co-sign or a good friend to co-sign. And it's not just them co-signing. It's
No,
like you
no.
said, the payment of the monthly amount, but also I've had people where they say, oh, my really good friend's going to co-sign, thinking that's all they need is their
Mhm.
name and their income. But if that person wants to go and do something in their own personal life, like maybe trade up on their house or buy a car or whatever, it's going to affect their credit. Even if
Yes.
the first person says, I'm going to pay the payments all by myself, just having that debt on the co-signers, I guess, credit bureau is going
Mhm.
to affect what they can do in the future as well, right?
Absolutely. And you might have a situation where a child has two parents, but only one of them co-sign. And then if the parents then want to buy, let's say, a second home or anything like that, we have to use the full mortgage payment, property taxes, and heat for the child's property when calculating what the parents will qualify. So that's very important when we have discussions with parents. Like typically if I have a child say, oh, I'm going to, my dad's going to co-sign or my mom, I have a conversation with that parent just to say, okay, this is exactly what this means. Are you planning on a move in a couple of years? Like, do you need to mortgage? Because this will impact you. So it's definitely an important conversation to have for sure.
And just to clarify, so if a parent co-signs for their child and say it's $500,000 mortgage that they're looking for, if the parent's going to look for financing for say a second home of their own, they're going to use the full 500,000 as debt on their credit?
Well, they're looking at what the monthly payments are, the property taxes, the heat, and if it's a condominium, half the condo fees. That will get factored into the parent's application.
Even though
Even
they're
though
buying
it
with
might be,
somebody else. That's
yeah,
very good to know, right? Because they
yeah,
may think, oh, it's
yeah,
only
because
half.
right, because from the lender's perspective, if the child doesn't pay, the parent has to pay. So, yeah, and also on the flip side, if we're doing an application with the child and the parent has a mortgage, we have to use the full mortgage payment, property taxes, and heat, and any other debt that that parent might have. If they have a car loan or a car lease, they're carrying lines of credits or credit card balances, that all gets factored in as well.
Right. And then, like you said, it's important to speak to an accountant because if the parent, maybe, I guess it depends on how they take ownership. If the parent is co signing and then they want
Yes.
to protect their funds and they go a percentage on that property as ownership, and let's just say they go 50%, when that property sells, the parent is going to pay capital gains on that 50%, which means the child isn't going to get as much as they could have otherwise. So it's all these different things that they have to think about. It's not just, I'm going to co sign, I'm going to gift you some money. It's all great. And it really does help as we're talking about kids, your kids being able to
Mm-hmm.
move forward in life. But you do have to think about the downsides and some of the things that might affect you in the future in doing
For
that.
sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's why, like for parents and children, I'll recommend the child takes 99% and the parent takes 1%. But sometimes parents want, if they're doing, half the down payment, they'll want 50% ownership just to protect themselves. But so there's
Hmm.
all ways to attack that, but they also have to then know, okay, you're going to have some capital gains to deal with here. So
Right. Because on
knowledge
the
is key.
Right. So on the one hand, you're saving on capital gains, but on the other hand, you may not be protected if your kid moves in with their girlfriend or boyfriend, and then they've been together for a period of time, and then they claim they want 50% of that property, which
Hmm.
was this, matrimonial
Yeah.
home, so to speak. So,
Hmm.
what piece of advice would you like to give our listeners as we kind of wrap up today's conversation?
So, the best advice I could give is just make sure you know what you're getting into. Be very thorough. Sit down if you're entering into ownership with a friend and go through all the possible issues that could come up and then come up with solutions for those issues. Have an agreement in place, sign it, and make copies, and just make sure you know exactly what could happen down the road if you need to exit or if an issue would arise.
Right. So I think it's still a great way for people, two different people to end up being able to purchase a property. But like you said, just sort of know the ins and outs of it so that you're making an informed and best decision for yourselves. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a great option. I mean, even if you had two people buy a property that maybe has a basement apartment, they're living on top, they rent the basement. There's so many advantages that could happen here. And, it doesn't have to be a forever plan, but it's a good plan to get into the market, create some wealth, and then split it down the road and then go your separate ways in terms of buying your own home.
Right. There are so many ways, and maybe we could do a podcast on that in the future. There's even ways where if you're living with your parents and you're not paying rent there, is you can purchase a property, rent it out, right? Even if you have to supplement the mortgage a little bit, but those renters are paying down your mortgage, do that for a couple of years, sell it, build that equity, and then go on and buy another property that you're going to live in on your own. So you're right. There are so many ways to be able to get into the market. So for you out there who are listening and feeling a little bit distraught that I'm never going to be able to get into the market, I think it's just, keep the faith, keep working at, putting your money aside, keep working at maintaining your credit, and look into some of these options and, find one that suits you and your financial abilities. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. And Corina, if our listeners want to get in touch with you and maybe they've got some different questions about mortgages or financing options, what's the best way for them to do that?
So a couple of ways. I can be reached by phone at 416-884-1428 or email. And also I am on Instagram and Facebook. My Instagram is Corina Mortgage Girl. There's lots of videos and tips on there on home ownership. So feel free to check me out, or you can contact Evelyn and she can make the connection.
And do you want to just also share your email address?
Sure. It's Corina@premiermortgage.ca.
Okay. And we'll put all of that down in the show notes so that people can have easy access to it. Thank you so much again for joining us today. As always, it's very insightful, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Bye now. Okay. So take 3. So today, so we'll start again.
Sorry. Okay.
That's what I was kind of
so
going
ask me
along
the question
those lines.
again.
Overall, there is, risks in joint tenancy, Okay, that was what I was looking for. Sorry about that.
No, that's
now
okay.
I probably totally lost you on what you were talking about, right?
No, not at all. We were talking about the pitfalls. And if you are thinking about buying a friend.
Another one.
And if you are thinking about buying a friend, you may want to put some of that savings that you have as prepared.
Yeah, sorry.